Before the city fully wakes, Massachusetts Avenue holds its breath. Headlights pass in narrow sweeps. Street lamps glare against winter air. Behind iron fences, stone facades rise with the confidence of a century that expected to last. This is Embassy Row now. Flags, security lights, official plaques. But the architecture predates the modern world that surrounds it. These houses were not built for ordinary time. They were built to outlive their owners. One mansion sits with a particular kind of weight. Heavy doors, tall windows set deep into masonry, a frontage designed less for comfort than for statement. At the turn of the 20th century, building here was not simply buying property. It was purchasing proximity to government, to finance, to the channels where influence becomes policy without ever calling itself politics. In that era, a home was a machine. It processed wealth into legitimacy. The money that paid for these walls did not originate in Washington. It traveled east from extraction and speculation, from distant ground turned into ledgers, from labor translated into dividends, from a boom strong enough to fund permanence. The Gilded Age excelled at this conversion. It could take a mine, a railroad contract, a merger, and render it into marble, staff, and invitations. And yet, the quiet truth of these buildings is that they are survivors of something that failed. Not the stone, not the craftsmanship, the system behind the stone. Because somewhere inside this kind of house the story often turns, not with scandal, not with a single dramatic fall, but with a gradual shift in who controls the money, how it is managed, what it is required to pay for, and how quickly a fortune can be consumed just to maintain the appearance that nothing has changed. This is the dark story of an heiress who inherited an empire-sized promise: wealth, status, access, and the illusion of permanence, and still watched that promise collapse into paperwork and sale notices. To understand how that happens, you have to begin where fortunes actually start, not in ballrooms, but in the economic machinery that built them. The fortune in this story didn't begin in Washington. It began in a landscape where money was not stored in banks or traded as stock certificates, but pulled out of the ground and carried away by rail. Late 19th century American wealth, especially the kind that could build dynasties, was often extraction wealth first: gold, silver, coal, timber. Then the secondary systems that made extraction scalable: freight schedules, smelters, mills, credit, insurance, and the legal frameworks that decided who could claim what and keep it. Colorado in the 1890s was one of the places where those systems collided at full speed. Mining districts rose and fell in seasons. Towns expanded, then hollowed out. A single strike could reorder a regional economy. A single failed shaft could erase a family. In this environment, security was not a salary. It was timing, information, and the ability to hold on long enough for a boom to mature into cash. Thomas F. Walsh is part of that era's typical pattern: immigrant origins, years of incremental work, and then a late breakthrough that rewrote everything. Some accounts describe him arriving in the United States in 1869, working in trades and mining-related businesses, and then being battered like many by the Panic of 1893, an event that flattened savings, credit, and confidence across the country. That matters because the Gilded Age did not only manufacture fortunes, it manufactured risk. A depression or panic wasn't simply bad luck, it was a structural feature of an economy that expanded faster than its safeguards. When credit tightened, even rich operations could collapse overnight. Survival often depended on whether you could pivot locations, re-enter the labor market, or gamble on a new claim when others were forced to sell. Walsh's pivot took him to Ouray, Colorado, where in 1896 he acquired the Camp Bird mine, an asset many assumed was nearly worked out. The mine turned out to be something else, productive enough to become one of the most famous in the region, later credited with roughly 1.5 million troy ounces of gold and 4 million troy ounces of silver over its long life. But the most important detail for an elite history story is not the metal itself. It is conversion. Mining wealth only becomes inherited empire when it is transformed into liquid capital and then anchored into institutions, real estate, banks, trusts, newspapers, political access. A mine can be rich and still be fragile. Its value depends on ore quality, labor stability, transport costs, metal prices, and whether the operation stays financed. Converting a mine into cash, selling at the right moment, is how booms become dynasties. In 1902, Walsh sold Camp Bird for a sum that appears in sources as $5.2 million, a staggering figure for the time. Other historical commentary gives a slightly higher number, $6 million, and even contemporary newspapers sometimes floated far larger totals. The exact figure matters less than what the sale represented. A frontier-grade fortune suddenly portable, ready to be planted somewhere that didn't smell like a mine. Walsh chose Washington. That choice tells you how power actually worked in the Gilded Age. New York had finance, Pittsburgh had industry, Chicago had distribution and commodities. Washington had something quieter but more durable: proximity to government, regulation, contracts, and national legitimacy. In an era when reputations traveled by newspaper and social networks, Washington offered a way to convert new money into respectability through access, embassies, senators, cabinet-level relationships, and the visible rituals of high society. Walsh moved his family to Washington in 1898, after the mine's success had effectively secured his arrival among America's wealthy. And then he did what the era's rich often did when they needed permanence. He built a house that functioned as a public declaration. Construction began around 1901 on Massachusetts Avenue, and the building permit process is documented as early as October 1901. The house is now known as the Walsh-McLean House, later the Embassy of Indonesia, and it was completed around 1903. The details are important because they show scale as policy. The mansion is described as costing about $8,000 or $35,000 at the time, among the most expensive residences in Washington, built on a scale intended to impress not just guests but the city itself. And the spending did not stop at stone and timber. Accounts note lavish furnishing expenditures. Figures as high as $2 million in furnishings are attached to the house's early years, reflecting the Gilded Age obsession with importing legitimacy through objects, art, textiles, European design language, rooms built for ritual rather than living. This is how you should understand inheritance in elite stories. It is not simply the transfer of money, it is the transfer of obligations disguised as beauty. A 60-room mansion is not a possession in the ordinary sense. It is an operating system. It demands staff, repairs, heating, security, renovations, and constant upkeep. It also demands something less visible: the social performance that justifies its existence. Entertaining, maintaining the calendar, hosting the people whose presence signals that the owner belongs at the top. In the Gilded Age, families built these structures not just because they were rich, but because they were trying to solve a problem: how to make wealth look inevitable. A mine could fail, a market could crash, a competitor could undercut prices. But a stone mansion in the capital, placed correctly, furnished correctly, filled correctly, projected stability even when stability was the one thing the era could not promise. This is why the story begins here, before the heiress becomes the center. Because the systems were already in place, the fortune was already committed to a lifestyle with a fixed cost. The legitimacy had already been purchased in architecture, and the family's wealth, born in the volatility of extraction, had been reshaped into a form that could not easily shrink without becoming visible. The house on Massachusetts Avenue was the triumph phase. The proof. And then, almost immediately, the most dangerous part of any elite fortune arrived. Not a rival, not a scandal, a timeline. Because once a fortune becomes an inheritance, it stops being a single person's project and becomes a system that must survive other people, other appetites, other decisions, and the long, slow grind of maintenance. Washington at the turn of the 20th century was not the loudest marketplace in America, but it was one of the most decisive. New York was where capital pooled. Pittsburgh was where steel made itself unavoidable. Chicago was where grain, meat, and rail schedules proved that logistics could be a form of domination. Washington was different. Washington was where the rules of every other city could be shaped, quietly, through regulation, contracts, appointments, and access. It was a place where influence didn't need to announce itself, because it could operate through proximity. That is why a Washington mansion mattered so much. A grand house on Massachusetts Avenue was not simply a home, it was a platform, a physical address that signaled legitimacy to diplomats, senators, financiers, and the press. In a city built around hierarchy, a residence could function like a credential. And in the same era, there was one institution that could amplify that credential beyond any drawing room: a newspaper. A major newspaper was not just a business. It was an instrument that could shape reputations, pressure officials, protect allies, injure rivals, and manufacture a version of public reality that everyone else had to navigate. Even for families already rich, the press offered something money alone couldn't guarantee: narrative control. This is where the McLean story enters, not as romance, not as gossip, but as infrastructure. The Washington Post began in 1877, but the key shift for our story comes in 1905 when it was purchased by John R. McLean, already wealthy from other publishing interests. In the Gilded Age, ownership of a newspaper was not a hobby, it was a lever. A family that owned a major paper could stand close enough to politics to feel like part of it. By the time Thomas Walsh was finishing his mansion, Washington's elite world had a clear architecture. Money could build the house. The right social network could fill it with the right people. A newspaper could make that network matter beyond the room. For a fortune to become a dynasty, it had to master all three, but there was a structural weakness inside newspaper dynasties that looked like strength from the outside. They were expensive, constantly. A large paper had printing plants, presses, paper supply contracts, delivery systems, payroll, and advertising cycles that could turn against you in a single bad year. Unlike a mine sale, where a fortune could be converted into cash and fixed, a newspaper was a living machine. It demanded management. It demanded attention, and in moments of market stress, it could become an engine that consumed its owners. That problem becomes sharper when control shifts from a founder to an heir. Because inheritance does not simply transfer assets. It transfers decision-making, often to people who did not build the system and who may not understand what keeps it stable. John R. McLean died in 1916, and the transition that followed illustrates an old elite pattern. When a family's wealth is large, it becomes surrounded by legal structures meant to protect it: trusts, executors, corporate boards, professional managers. Those structures are supposed to preserve wealth, but they also create friction. They can split authority into pieces. The heir has the name, but not always the control. The estate has money, but it may be restricted. The trustees have power, but not the public responsibility. The business requires decisive management, but management is now filtered through courts and legal obligations. In other words, the dynasty becomes bureaucratic. According to reporting on the Post's history, by the early 1930s, the paper's financial situation had deteriorated so badly that it ended in receivership and bankruptcy sale. A Washington Post retrospective recounts a key pressure point. International paper forced a bankruptcy sale to collect $700,000 the Post was unable to pay. That number matters. Not because $700,000 is the total of what was lost, but because it shows how collapses actually happen at elite scale. Dynasties rarely fall because they run out of money in some dramatic final moment. They fall because they can't meet obligations when they come due. Paper contracts, payroll, interest, lawsuits, and 1,000 costs that don't care about reputation. And when those obligations can't be met, control shifts, not by scandal, by procedure. The Post's ownership changed hands in the most unromantic setting imaginable, a public auction. In 1933, financier Eugene Meyer bought the paper at auction for $825,000, ending the McLean era. The dynasty did not disappear overnight, but the mechanism that gave it institutional leverage, the newspaper, passed into someone else's hands. This is what the Gilded Age rarely prepared heirs to understand. Power is not just possession, it is custody. You can inherit a mansion and still lose your ability to control the systems that make the mansion meaningful. Now return to the Walsh fortune. Thomas Walsh did what many self-made tycoons tried to do near the end of their rise. He anchored his wealth in stone and reputation. His house was completed in 1903 and described as the most expensive residence in Washington at the time, with a price tag around $8,000 to $35,000, plus extensive furnishings acquired over years. That house was meant to be a stabilizer, an announcement that volatility had been defeated. But the reality is harsher. A mansion doesn't stabilize wealth. It stabilizes appearance. It also raises the fixed cost of life. Staff, repairs, social obligations, the constant pressure to remain in place, even when the underlying wealth is shifting into riskier forms, legal disputes, trust management, business losses, and liabilities that grow quietly behind the scenes. This is the atmosphere your heiress inherits. Not just money, but a machine built to convert money into status every day, without pause. And when the Walsh fortune intersects with the McLean publishing empire, two different forms of elite power, one born from extraction and one rooted in institutional influence, the result is not automatic security. It is a larger system with more moving parts, more expectations, more vulnerabilities. Because from this point onward, the story is not simply about a woman with wealth. It is about the angles of power surrounding her, how elite life actually functions, what it costs, and how easily an inheritance can be consumed just maintaining the surface. In Washington, power rarely looks like domination. It looks like access. At the start of the 20th century, the capital is still small enough that proximity can replace formality. The people who matter occupy a narrow physical radius. Government offices, hotels, clubs, embassies, private dining rooms. Decisions move through routines. Who is introduced to whom, who is invited, who is listened to without needing an appointment. In that environment, an address is not decoration. It is a credential. This is why Thomas F. Walsh's mansion on Massachusetts Avenue functions like a power instrument, not a luxury. It sits in what becomes the DuPont Circle/Embassy Row world, a place where nations post their representatives and where American influence often arranges itself into quiet rooms. The building is not simply large. It is designed to host the rituals that turn wealth into recognition. Completed in 1903, it is described as the most expensive residence in the city at the time, with about 60 rooms and purpose-built spaces for spectacle, ballroom, theater, salon, architecture shaped for hierarchy. Now add the second lever, a newspaper. A major paper is an amplifier. It can normalize someone's legitimacy and punish someone's defiance. It doesn't need to command the government to influence it. It can tilt public perception until the government's choices narrow. The McLean family's ownership of the Washington Post, purchased by John R. McLean in 1905, places that family in a specific category of elite, the kind that can make reputations easier or harder to maintain. So when Evelyn Walsh marries Edward Ned McLean in 1908, two different power systems connect. One is extraction wealth converted into Washington legitimacy through stone, staff, and social positioning. The other is institutional influence, media power that can extend far beyond any one room. From the outside, that looks like permanence. From the inside, it creates something more fragile, a life where power must be maintained daily, because it depends on continuing control of complex systems, property, public perception, and institutions that can bleed money when mismanaged. And Washington is unforgiving about mismanagement, because its elite culture rewards stability and punishes visible disorder. A family may remain known, but knowledge is not the same as dominance. In the capital, real power is measured by who still returns your calls, who still treats you as inevitable, and who stops doing so without making it public. That is the first angle. Power here is not a crown. It is a network you must keep paying for. The Gilded Age trained America to confuse wealth with invulnerability. A mine sale for millions in 1902 sounds like a permanent victory. The Camp Bird mine, acquired by Walsh in 1896, was productive enough that he sold it for $5.2 million in 1902, turning extraction into portable capital. But portable capital doesn't stay portable once you convert it into a way of life, because elite wealth is never just held. It is deployed. It becomes properties with upkeep. It becomes staffs with payroll. It becomes charitable obligations, social seasons, travel, art, wardrobes, tuition, doctors, legal fees, and the constant invisible spending required to appear effortless. A mansion alone demonstrates the logic. The Walsh-McLean house is described as costing $835,000 to build, with furnishings that sources place around $2 million acquired over years. That is not merely consumption, it is commitment. A lifestyle built at that level can't easily scale down without becoming a visible confession. And then there is the difference between a fortune that generates income and a fortune that must be liquidated to sustain itself. Mining wealth is often a one-time conversion event. You get rich by selling at the right moment. Newspaper wealth is different. It can generate influence, but it can also become a financial liability during downturns. The Washington Post's later crisis is an example of how elite collapse actually looks in the real world. Not a dramatic ruin, but an inability to meet obligations. In the early 1930s, the paper was forced into a bankruptcy sale under pressure from creditors. Reporting notes that International Paper forced the sale to collect $700,000 the Post could not pay. That single detail tells you what losing an empire often means at elite level. It means an account payable that becomes unmanageable. It means a creditor who does not accept reputation as collateral. It means procedure. Receivership, court orders, auctions. Control shifting away through paperwork rather than scandal. This is why the heiress who inherited everything is such a dangerous myth. An inheritance is not a vault. It is a set of systems and obligations, and the larger it is, the more it attracts complexity. Trusts, managers, advisors, lawsuits, and people whose incentives do not match the family's long-term stability. Evelyn Walsh-McLean's public story becomes associated with spectacle, especially the Hope Diamond, purchased for $180,000 and tied to Cartier's marketing and to Washington society's obsession with objects that signal status. But the deeper financial story is quieter. Expensive institutions and expensive rituals can consume even a vast fortune if the underlying income cannot keep pace with the cost of remaining unchanged. That is the second angle. Wealth does not vanish in a single gamble. It dissolves into maintenance. The Walsh-McLean house was built to look permanent, and it is permanent in the way stone can be permanent. It survives owners. It remains useful to institutions. It outlasts the reasons it was commissioned. Today, it serves as the embassy of Indonesia, but its origins are pure Gilded Age logic. Architecture as social proof. The building's scale is deliberate. 60 rooms, ballroom, theater, grand staircase, spaces designed to be seen, to host, to create the feeling that the family belonged to a class that could not be questioned. In elite history, Architecture is never neutral. It broadcasts hierarchy. A home like this does not simply reflect power, it helps manufacture it. Guests do not just visit, they absorb a message. This family can command labor, material, taste, and time. The house becomes evidence that the fortune has matured into a dynasty. But that is also where the trap sits. A house of this scale becomes a fixed-cost empire. Heating, restoration, staffing, continuous repair, and because elite architecture is also social architecture, the house must be activated to fulfill its purpose. Empty rooms do not perform legitimacy. Quiet seasons look like retreat. Retreat looks like decline. So, the mansion's existence places pressure on the family to keep the ritual running, which means more events, more visibility, more dependence on reputation management, more spending to maintain the surface. The house is not merely a location, it is a schedule, and in Washington, schedule is currency. Because the capital's elite ecosystem does not only care about wealth, it cares about order, about who is still inside and who is now outside. The house is a beacon that announces belonging, but it also functions as a spotlight that makes any fracture easier to see. When the family's financial and institutional control erodes, when the newspaper is no longer theirs, when debts accumulate, when the fortune is restructured under legal constraints, the mansion doesn't shrink with them. It remains full-sized, continuing to demand the costs of a world that may no longer exist for its owners. Eventually, those costs turn architectural permanence into a kind of quiet pressure, a building that outlives the system that paid for it, forcing the truth into daylight through sales, rentals, and repurposing. That is the third angle. The house is meant to prove permanence, but it can end up documenting decline. And once you understand that, you can see why the most dangerous arena for an heiress is not the market or the courtroom. It is the social structure that watches, measures, and decides what a family still is. In Gilded Age America, heiress is not simply a description of wealth. It's a job title issued by society. It comes with expectations that are rarely written down but constantly enforced. How you dress, where you appear, who you host, what you fund, what you ignore, what you forgive, and what you must never allow to become public. The money may belong to the family, but the reputation belongs to the city. And Washington's elite class is uniquely disciplined about reputation, because reputation is what keeps access open. In New York, a fortune could be loud and still succeed. In Washington, instability is treated like contamination. The moment a family looks unpredictable, financially, socially, emotionally, doors don't slam. They simply stop opening. For an heiress, this turns wealth into a kind of enclosed space. She can be seen everywhere and still be controlled by what must not be seen. Conflict inside the marriage, strain inside the business, friction inside the estate plan, private grief, private debt. The public expects the surface to stay smooth. The larger the fortune, the stronger the expectation. This is why the ritual matters so much. Balls, dinners, weekends, charity events, headline-worthy displays of taste. They are not leisure. They are maintenance work for status. And that maintenance work is not equally distributed. A male heir can be permitted public failure and still be treated as unfortunate. A female heir is often treated as the visible custodian of the family's respectability. If the dynasty begins to wobble, she becomes the person asked to keep it looking upright. So even when the structure behind the scenes begins to shift, when money becomes entangled with trusts, when creditors begin to circle, when the business side loses competence, the heiress is still expected to produce proof that everything is stable. A full house, a full calendar, a full table. The paradox is brutal. The more the family needs to cut costs, the more the social system pressures them to spend, because less reads as decline. And in an elite hierarchy, decline is not a private misfortune. It is a public signal that invites other people to renegotiate their relationship to you. This is where the title's tragedy begins to take shape. Inherited everything sounds like security, But in the elite world, it often means inheriting the role of keeping a collapsing structure from becoming visible. And visibility is what Washington punishes. Most dynasties don't lose everything in one dramatic moment. They lose control in a series of small, expensive, irreversible steps. Step 1 is usually fixed costs. A large estate, especially one built as a symbol, has expenses that do not adjust to mood or market. Staff wages don't disappear because the owner feels cautious. Roof repairs don't wait for a better year. Insurance and taxes arrive on schedule. Heating systems fail on winter nights, not on convenient ones. Even the simplest keep-it-running costs can be enough to force sales of liquid assets when income slows. Step 2 is mismatch between the fortune's origin and the fortune's lifestyle. A mining fortune can be immense, but it can also be concentrated, locked to a boom period, realized through a sale, then spread out across properties and spending. If that wealth is not placed into a structure that reliably produces income, the lifestyle begins to consume principal. From the outside, it looks like wealth continuing. From the inside, it can be liquidation disguised as normal life. Step 3 is institutional fragility. Newspapers, banks, real estate portfolios, these assets don't just sit. They require leadership and discipline. When leadership weakens, they can turn from asset to liability. Costs rise, revenues fall. Debt becomes easier than downsizing, decisions get delayed. The machine still runs, but it runs on borrowed time. Step 4 is legal complexity. Large fortunes attract legal architecture, trusts, executors, guardians, boards, attorneys, professional managers. This can protect heirs from predators, but it can also trap the fortune in slow motion. Decision-making becomes fragmented. Money becomes restricted. Control becomes something you negotiate rather than something you hold. And the most dangerous part of that system is that it can keep the outward appearance intact while the inner structure deteriorates. That is why elite decline is so often misunderstood by the public. The cars still arrive, the lights still go on, the invitations still go out, but behind the scenes, assets are being sold to pay for the performance of stability. Debt is being rolled forward. Trust distributions are being argued over. Cash is being pulled from places it was never meant to be pulled from, because the alternative is admitting the dynasty is no longer what it claims. A property becomes too expensive to maintain. A court decision changes who can sign what. A business can no longer cover its costs. To banks, to trustees, to new owners, to institutions that don't care about the family name, only about the numbers. This is the final angle. The end of an empire is rarely a headline. It is a change in custody, and once custody begins to shift away from the family, everything in their world, house, status, access, identity, starts to feel the pull of inevitability. By the time the Walsh fortune reached Washington in its final form, stone, staff, season, ceremony, it was already committed to a particular kind of life. The Walsh-McLean house was completed in 1903, and accounts describe it as the city's most expensive residence at the time, costing about $835,000 to build, with 60 rooms, performance spaces like a theater and ballroom, and furnishings that took years to assemble. Figures as high as $2 million are attached to those early interiors. This is not decorative context. It is the financial climate of the story. A house like that does not sit. It runs. It requires labor every day and repairs every season. It creates a calendar that doesn't stop because the economy shifts. It also creates a reputational expectation. If the house exists at that scale, the public assumes the money exists at that scale too. Then the timeline begins to tighten. Thomas F. Walsh dies in 1909, and the family's center of gravity shifts from the man who made the fortune to the people who must live inside it. And by then, Evelyn Walsh has already joined another dynasty mechanism. She married Edward Ned McLean in 1908, connecting the Walsh fortune to the family that owned the Washington Post. From the outside, it looks like multiplication. Two elite systems joined together. From the inside, it creates a larger machine with more moving parts. Because a newspaper is not a trophy asset. It is a business that demands discipline, and in downturns, it can become a furnace. The Post's later crisis is one of the clearest examples of how elite decline becomes inevitable without ever becoming dramatic. There is no single event that ends a dynasty. There is a progression. Obligations outpacing revenue, creditors tightening, courts stepping in, and control shifting away in ways that don't care who the family is. The public face of the McLean world stays bright for years. Washington society remains fascinated by the spectacle, the house, the hosting, the objects that signal taste and invulnerability. The most famous object is the Hope Diamond, which Pierre Cartier spent years trying to sell to the McLeans. The Smithsonian's history notes that Cartier ultimately sold it to Ned and Evelyn Walsh McLean in 1912 after 2 years of effort. Whether the sale figure is framed as $180,000 or placed in higher estimates depending on the source, the diamond functions in the story as a symbol of the era's logic. Wealth made visible as proof that wealth is stable. But stability in elite systems is not a feeling. It is management. And this is where the turning point begins to form, not as scandal, but as structure. When John R. McLean dies in 1916, the Post is no longer only a powerful institution. It becomes part of an estate system, executors, trustees, legal control, and the question of who has authority to make decisions in real time. This is the part of inheritance that is rarely described in glamour terms. A dynasty can have assets and still lose control, because control is what determines whether an asset survives as a source of power or collapses into a source of liability. As the years move forward, the costs remain constant and the pressures multiply. The house still runs at full scale. The social rituals still demand performance. The paper still requires payroll, equipment, paper supply, and steady advertising revenue. The family's name still carries weight, but weight is not the same as liquidity. Then, America enters the era that punishes poorly managed systems without needing to hate them, the late 1920s and early 1930s. The Great Depression does not need to invent a villain. It simply tightens every margin. Advertising revenue becomes harder. Credit becomes more cautious. Suppliers become less flexible. Legal structures become less patient. If an institution is being run with waste, or even simply with optimism, the Depression converts that optimism into debt. By the early 1930s, the Post is no longer an instrument of dominance. It is described as a hemorrhage inside the family estate. In a 1983 Washington Post retrospective about Eugene Meyer's purchase, the paper notes that International Paper forced a bankruptcy sale to collect $700,000 the Post could not pay, and that Ned McLean had been ousted by court order from management. The American Security and Trust Company, acting as executor of his father's will, backed the sale to stop the severe financial bleeding. Read that slowly because it is the actual mechanism of elite decline. A creditor demands money owed. A court intervenes in management. A trust company, obligated to preserve what it can, chooses sale over continued collapse. The institution leaves the family. No scandal is required. No moral judgment is necessary. The system is simply doing what systems do when the numbers stop working, and when the Post is no longer secure, everything surrounding it becomes more fragile. Because the Walsh McLean empire is not a single pile of money. It is a web of costs and reputational obligations that assume continuous support from large, functioning assets. When one major asset turns into an emergency, the entire web begins to tighten. At that point, even wealth becomes complicated. Some money is locked in property. Some is tied up in legal structures. Some is committed to upkeep and staff. Some is required to service debt. Some is simply gone, spent over years on a life that could not easily scale down without becoming publicly visible. This is why the turning point of the Heiress's story does not look like a single fall. It looks like a shift in custody. The family remains socially recognizable, but the engines that once made the recognition matter begin to move out of their hands. First through legal intervention, then through creditor pressure, then through formal bankruptcy procedure. And by the time those procedures are in motion, the end becomes a matter of schedule. Not because anyone wants a public ruin, but because the system cannot keep funding the performance of permanence. The decisive moment is close now. It will happen in public, not because the family seeks spectacle, but because institutions resolve ownership in public when private solutions fail. A newspaper that once shaped Washington's reality is about to be sold like any other asset that can't meet its bills. And on that day, the Gilded Age illusion, that inheritance, means permanence, will finally meet the most indifferent force in elite history, the auctioneer's voice. On the day the Post is sold, the event is almost offensively ordinary, not because it isn't historic, but because that is how power transfers in modern systems, through legal procedure, public notices, and the quiet discipline of creditors who do not negotiate with prestige. By the early 1930s, the McLean era has moved past trouble and into formal containment. The Washington Post's own retrospective of the sale describes the mechanics with clinical clarity. International paper forced the bankruptcy sale to collect $700,000 the paper could not pay. Ned McLean had been ousted by court order from management, and American Security and Trust Company, acting as executor of John R. McLean's will, supported the sale to stop what it called a severe financial hemorrhage of the estate. This is the real sound of a dynasty ending, not scandal, not a dramatic confession, a debt amount typed neatly with a due date, and a court that decides the owner is no longer permitted to steer the ship. In elite mythology, decline is supposed to come from personal failure, bad character, bad morals, a single reckless night. But in the historical record, decline is often managerial and structural. A large institution running at a loss inside a family that is still spending as though the institution is profitable. The Post, once the family's amplifier, becomes the family's liability. And once a flagship asset is placed inside bankruptcy procedure, the rest of the fortune begins to feel the gravity of that process. Because bankruptcy is not just financial, it is reputational. It publicly announces that the family can no longer absorb its own costs. Then comes the sale itself. In 1933, the paper is purchased at a public bankruptcy auction by financier Eugene Meyer for $825,000, a figure repeated across multiple accounts, including Reuters' historical timeline and case study summaries of the paper's long arc. Again, read what that means. A newspaper that once shaped Washington's atmosphere, who looked legitimate, who looked dangerous, who looked inevitable, is now transferred like any other distressed asset. Not because it has no value, because the owner can no longer carry the cost of keeping it. At that moment, the McLean name remains socially recognizable. But the mechanism that made the name strategically useful, the institutional lever, has moved to someone else's hands. And when that lever moves, everything around it changes. A dynasty can survive embarrassment. It can survive gossip. It can even survive personal tragedy. What it struggles to survive is loss of control over the institutions that convert wealth into authority. After 1933, Washington does not need to reject the family. It can simply reroute around them. Power is opportunistic. It flows to the owners who can keep the machinery running. That is why the climax is not just the auction. It is what the auction forces into the open, the difference between being famous and being powerful. A family can remain famous while its influence dissolves. The name stays bright. The command structure is gone. Now return to the heiress at the center of your title. The Walsh fortune, the money that began in extraction and was converted into a Washington fortress, had already committed itself to a high-cost identity long before the Post collapse. The Walsh-McLean house, completed in 1903, is documented at 60 rooms and a construction cost of $835,000, Dogs, exclusive of furnishings, by historic records and architectural histories. It was designed for spectacle, with spaces like a ballroom and theater. That matters because when a family loses a major income engine, the first pressure does not appear in marble. Upkeep continues. Staff still expects payroll. Properties still demand maintenance. Social obligations still arrive. But now, the money that quietly supported all of it is either gone, restricted, or needed elsewhere. This is where elite decline becomes a form of invisible triage. You cut where the public won't notice first. You sell what can be sold without announcing weakness. You borrow against what still has value. You restructure what you can into trusts and legal protections that buy time. And you keep the facade running as long as possible. Because in elite society, the facade is not a luxury. It is a shield. The public often confuses that shield for stability. So the cars still arrive. The lights still go on behind tall windows. The house still appears to function. And because Washington is trained to treat appearances as signals, the city can pretend the old order is still in place, until it isn't. The tragedy is that the systems themselves accelerate the decline. Once an estate becomes legally entangled, creditors, trustees, executors, court decisions, every decision becomes slower, more expensive, and harder to reverse. Lawyers and managers become part of the fixed cost. Family disputes become financial events. And a fortune that was once too large to fail becomes something that can be eaten from the inside by administration alone. Even the most famous artifact associated with the heiress, her association with the Hope Diamond, illustrates how public narrative can persist while underlying stability fractures. The Smithsonian's official history notes that Pierre Cartier sold the Hope Diamond to Ned and Evelyn Walsh McLean in 1912, after 2 years of effort. Other reputable accounts place the deal earlier in the process, often 1911 for the agreed purchase price and arrangement, with subsequent legal finalization and settlement later. That discrepancy itself is revealing, because what the public remembers is the symbol, a diamond, a cursed story, the idea of wealth so excessive it can buy anything. What the record shows is a more ordinary reality, transactions negotiated, formalized, disputed, resolved. Paperwork, not myth. And that is the shape of the heiress's loss, not the loss of visibility, the loss of the machinery behind visibility. By the time the Post leaves the family in 1933, the McLean dynasty's center of power has already shifted out of reach. And once that happens, the Walsh inheritance, already welded to a high-cost capital city identity, faces a future where maintaining what it was becomes an expense that no longer generates dominance. The Gilded Age promised heirs permanence through scale, but scale is expensive, and permanence is not something you can purchase once. It has to be financed every year. After the auction, the story no longer asks whether the empire can remain intact. It asks a colder question: who will own the pieces when it isn't? Because that is what happens next in elite decline. The assets don't disappear. They are redistributed, slowly, legally, and often with less drama than anyone expects. After the 1933 bankruptcy auction, the McLean name didn't vanish. It simply stopped owning the machine that had made the name strategically useful. The Washington Post, once the family's amplifier, moved into the hands of Eugene Meyer, who bought it at the bankruptcy auction for $825,000. The transfer wasn't moral, it wasn't personal, it was procedural, triggered by creditor pressure, enforced through court action, and supported by an executor whose legal duty was to stop the estate from bleeding out. That distinction matters because it explains what elite decline really looks like. Not disgrace. A change in custody. The institutions of power, creditors, courts, trust companies, don't cancel a dynasty. They reassign its assets when the numbers no longer sustain the performance. In this case, International Paper's $700,000 claim, the court's removal of Ned McLean from management, and the executor's support for sale form the mechanical backbone of the collapse. And once an institution leaves the family, the rest of the elite ecosystem adjusts without noise. Washington keeps moving. Invitations still exist. Names are still recognized. But the old leverage is gone. The capital's attention migrates toward whoever now controls the live instruments: ownership, payroll, print runs, political relationships, and the quiet authority that comes from being able to fund stability. For the heiress at the center of the title, the aftermath is less about public exile and more about financial reality finally catching up to the architecture. The Walsh-McLean House, the 60-room residence completed in 1903 and described as the city's most expensive at the time, was built as a monument to permanence, with a cost recorded as 835,000 plus years of major furnishings. But a monument has operating costs, and those costs don't shrink when control slips away from the family's major income engines. So the household becomes a kind of pressure chamber, not because the family suddenly becomes poor in a single moment, but because the fixed-cost world they created demands constant liquidity. And, in elite life, liquidity is often the first thing to disappear, tied up in property, entangled in legal structures, consumed by obligations, or redirected to cover losses elsewhere. When Evelyn Walsh-McLean died in 1947, the story resolves the way many Gilded Age fortunes do, not in an explosion, but in settlement. Sources note that her debts were significant enough that the mansion itself was ultimately sold. In 1952, it was sold to the government of Indonesia for use as an embassy. That sale is not just a real estate footnote, it's a signature of systemic decline. Because in the Gilded Age, the house was the proof of the dynasty. In the aftermath, the house becomes the asset that must be surrendered, its purpose fulfilled, its symbolism intact, but its ownership transferred to an institution that can afford the permanent costs. The building survives. The family's direct claim to it does not. The same pattern repeats with the most famous object attached to her name. In 1949, Harry Winston purchased Mrs. McLean's entire jewelry collection, including the Hope Diamond, from her estate. This is what elite aftermath often becomes. Objects moving more cleanly than power. Jewels are liquid. They can be sold, consolidated, transported, exhibited, and reframed. The family story fades, but the artifacts remain valuable, and in a way more stable than the inheritance system that once held them. So, by the late 1940s and early 1950s, the empire has changed form. The newspaper becomes someone else's institution. The mansion becomes a diplomatic asset. The jewelry becomes inventory, then legend, then eventually a public object with a new narrative. What remains is the most uncomfortable truth in elite history. The system preserves structures and objects more reliably than it preserves dynasties. And once the family's assets begin moving into institutional hands, the story stops being about what the heiress owned and becomes about what the world decided to keep. By the time the mansion is sold, the story has already revealed its core pattern. The family doesn't disappear. The family is de-instrumented. The assets that once translated wealth into influence, house, newspaper, objects, move into hands that can keep them operational. The system doesn't destroy the symbols of power, it repurposes them. The Walsh-McLean House, completed in 1903 and documented as costing about $835,000 with 60 rooms and purpose-built spectacle spaces like a theater and ballroom, survives precisely because it is useful to institutions with long budgets and long horizons. When Evelyn Walsh-McLean dies on April 26, 1947, the house is no longer primarily a family expression. It becomes a balance sheet fact, an expensive, maintainable, sellable structure. And in 1952, it is sold to the government of Indonesia for embassy use. That single transfer explains the kind of aftermath elite America produces. A Gilded Age mansion was originally built to prove permanence by private means. Stone as status, staff as proof, space as hierarchy. In the aftermath, permanence is achieved another way, by becoming state property, diplomatic property, institutional property, held by an entity whose identity is not threatened by maintenance costs or by the need to look unchanged. The building gets to remain grand because it no longer has to perform family dominance. It only has to function, and the objects follow the same logic. Public memory often attaches Evelyn Walsh McLean to the Hope Diamond, because it is the kind of artifact that compresses an era into one image, rare, expensive, surrounded by rumors, and carried through rooms designed to be watched. Sources differ on how they frame the transaction timeline, but the basic fact is stable. The diamond entered the McLean world via Pierre Cartier in the early 1910s and became part of the family's public mythology. In the aftermath, mythology becomes liquidity. The Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History records that in 1949, jeweler Harry Winston purchased the Hope Diamond along with the rest of Evelyn Walsh McLean's jewelry collection. That detail is crucial. It wasn't a single treasure changing hands for romance or drama. It was an estate being converted into cash, collection consolidated, value extracted, obligations settled. Winston then does what the family system could no longer do. He stabilizes the object by giving it a new institutional pathway. After exhibiting it for years, Winston donated the Hope Diamond to the Smithsonian in 1958, moving it from private legend into public custody, an artifact with a permanent home that doesn't depend on one family's finances. So the heiress's inheritance ends in a form that's almost clinical. The newspaper becomes someone else's institution after the 1933 bankruptcy sale. This is why the story feels darker than a scandal-driven downfall. A scandal can be contained, denied, litigated, reframed. But redistribution is indifferent. It does not require public humiliation. It only requires that the owners can no longer carry the costs of ownership. And it leaves behind a haunting kind of residue. Structures still standing, objects still shining, names still recognizable, while the underlying command, the private authority that once made those things an empire, has been quietly reassigned. Which raises the final question this kind of history always leaves behind. If you can inherit everything, money, status, proximity, even legend, what does it actually take to make any of it last? In the Gilded Age, the nation learned to treat scale as proof. A house with 60 rooms meant permanence. A name printed in society columns meant protection. A newspaper meant influence. A diamond meant invulnerability. The public could see the symbols, and the symbols seemed to confirm the myth, that once wealth reached a certain height, it became immune to time. But the long arc of this story shows something colder. Wealth is not the same as endurance. A fortune can be enormous and still be structurally fragile if it is built on one conversion event, then committed to a fixed cost identity. Mining wealth can arrive like a flood and then recede. A mansion does not stop that recession. It only makes the shoreline easier to measure. The house continues to demand payroll, repairs, taxes, staff, and performance, year after year, long after the original engine that paid for it has changed form, and institutions are even less forgiving than architecture. A newspaper is not a trophy. It is a living system. It requires management, discipline, and constant attention to economics that do not respect reputation. When those systems fall out of alignment, when costs remain high, revenue weakens, and decisions slow, power does not collapse with a sound. It transfers with documents. A creditor insists. A court acts. An executor chooses survival over pride. An auctioneer completes what the market began. That is why the end feels so quiet. The dynasty does not explode. It is unthreaded, one instrument at a time. The post leaves the family at a bankruptcy sale. The mansion leaves the family to an embassy. The jewels leave the family through an estate purchase, then enter a museum where they can last without the burdens of private custody. The objects remain magnificent. The structures remain useful. The name remains recognizable. But none of those things by themselves are power. Power is the ability to keep the machinery running, and the machinery of elite life is expensive, not just in money, but in governance. It requires restraint, strategy, and an understanding that inheritance is not a reward. It is a timed responsibility. The larger the fortune, the more it depends on systems the heir did not design and cannot fully control: markets, creditors, courts, trustees, public scrutiny, and the simple mathematics of maintenance. So the tragic story here is not that an heiress failed. It is that the Gilded Age promised heirs permanence through scale, when scale is exactly what makes a fortune harder to preserve. A mansion can outlive the family that built it because stone can be handed to institutions. A diamond can outlive its owners because an object can be transferred cleanly. But a dynasty must outlive itself through decision-making, through management, through discipline across decades, and that is the rarest inheritance of all, because when the money finally stops paying for the illusion of permanence, what remains is the simplest proof of history's indifference. The building still stands, and the empire is gone.